So what if you could play Warhammer against some truly automated opponents, resolve dice and damage at the touch of a button if desired, and play a sort of digitised game of Warhammer 40k, but still be able to use your real-world models? Let's take a look at one bit of speculative technology that could be a first glimpse as to how wargaming might be played in the future. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today I'm doing a slightly different video. I was basically reached out to by a project called Wargame Simulator and asked if I wanted to do a sponsored video about their developing technology. I thought I'd be interested enough to cover it for a full video, as I feel like it's an interesting first look as to what might happen with wargaming in the future, particularly with things like camera setups, AI software, and all sorts of things have been developing at a pace, all of that getting ever more accessible. They were perfectly happy for me to talk through a whole bunch of pros, cons, and a bunch of potential steep barriers to overcome for all this to work, but I must admit I found the idea pretty intriguing, and I think people who enjoy their technology for its own sake could get a kick out of it. As mentioned, the project's run by Wargame Simulator, primarily headed up by one smart guy called Chris, and he's trying to launch this project with a Kickstarter which I'll link down in the video description. The basic idea is to set up a system where you can kind of digitize your games of Warhammer or other sorts of war games. So you have your actual physical models on the tabletop and then a camera set up, and that can trap where the miniatures are, feed it into a computer, and then that allows you to do all sorts of things that you just wouldn't really be able to do very easily in game in terms of automation, recording, stats and more. The idea is that you could basically have a camera set up with cameras looking down over the battlefield. At each turn it can take and process an image of what's happened, record the footprints of the units, and then you could potentially use that for a bunch of applications both when you're actually playing or looking back on previous games. I think perhaps the biggest draw that people might have is the potential in-game advantages that you might have. If the camera and computer setup works well and the interface is super intuitive to use, it could genuinely speed up time, potentially resolving dice rolls and damage mechanics really quite quickly, automatically measuring where models or units are in range of each other and what sort of roll they need to pass a charge and that sort of things, and potentially helping with other admin things on the side, such as objective tracking. There's also the potential for a bit of an automated opponent in one way or another. If you had a computer system that understood the placings of all the models, you could basically have an AI opponent of different difficulties, and that definitely could be a draw for people who are a long way from clubs or other players, or even you could use it as a sort of solo or co-op mode. You could also use such a thing for looking back over past games to check whether you could have done things differently against certain opponents maybe, perhaps making old school battle reports like the classic ones that you got in White Dwarf, or just generating fun stats like kill tallies for your units in games. Maybe that could be handy for certain things like Crusade potentially. I'd say that these are all of the potential positives, and in reality there's a whole bunch of barriers that would have to be overcome to make them work well for any one person, which I'll get onto towards the end of the video. With those lofty goals in mind though, the basic idea that Wargame Simulator is trying to do is aims to be done via an app on a smartphone. The idea is that you need a camera set up to hold your phone or other recording device over the battlefield so it could see all the position of the unit, and then use that to track things like units, terrain and objective locations to determine positions of all that on the board. At the moment their system works by using a little paper transponder token type thing. The computer uses some AI software to recognise the general size and shape of the models, and then is assisted to recognise individual units by a little paper token next to the unit, so they know that the miniatures next to that will correspond to the unit that it's got in its databanks. You can see an example overhead view here on the right, a camera recognising a whole bunch of teams in games suspended from above the battlefield. You can see a bit of it in action here. With a camera above, it's possible to track the locations of these assault intercessors and gene stealers, even when they're moved about a bit, and they can measure ranges and things calibrated from the distance of objective markers placed on the board at a known distance apart from each other. For this ProStart system to work, it will still be a bit of setup though. You need a smartphone with a functional camera, a way to position it above the battlefield so you can see it all pretty well. Apparently most standard smartphones work being around about 52 inches above the playing surface, which really is quite high up. You need to have some sort of standard mount thing. To get it working myself, I bought a small telescopic arm off Amazon and attached it to a lamp. Though it could vary a bit, and if you wanted smaller playing surfaces it could be a fair bit lower down, and certain cameras with a better field of vision might do a bit better than that. On top of that you would need a second device for other inputs. Basically if one device is going to be the camera system, then you need something to actually operate the app, say a PC in the corner of the room or a laptop or something. And then beyond the actual miniatures, you need objective markers that the system can recognise, plus those paper transponder tokens, the objective markers being physically posted out apparently, and the paper ones being available to download and print to basically signify which unit is which. As mentioned, there are a massive bunch of really quite interesting things that you could do with that, automatic measurements and resolving dice rolls being one of them, battle reports and statistics. They give a few examples of in-game achievements like the amount of tanks or monsters that you might have killed or the amount of bugs you might have zapped. Could be a kind of fun for a little bit of gamification of your kills and things between games. As mentioned, there's the possibility for wargames versus a computer opponent. Kind of an interesting idea to be able to do that with Warhammer, which isn't usually very possible just due to the complexity of the game. I imagine delivering a computer opponent that actually played the game well would be really quite complex to achieve. But if it was able to be done, it would genuinely be very cool to try and test a list if you had a bit of free time or no opponent free, or just wanted to see how your list might perform on paper against a few big nasty things out there, even if it might lack the subtleties of a real player. Another option could be the potential for tracking dice as well. If you can roll dice with a camera having an unobstructed view to them, then it would be possible to be able to count the number of successes or fails. So there might still be an option to roll your own dice and then have the results be keyed into the system with successes and fails and things. Though I can imagine it might be a little bit fiddly if you had to both tell the computer exactly what dice are being rolled for what and then roll them and basically communicate that to a computer as well as just your opponent. I feel like that might be a little bit on the overly complex side of things and slow things down, if anything, versus if you're going for this digital sort of thing and doing a bit of auto-resolving of rolls. There are quite a few potential issues with it, which I'll broadly get onto in the later section of the video, but maybe one of the most obvious ones for tracking models moving around a tabletop would be overhanging terrain. If you're playing on a complicated 3D battlefield, as most people tend to be playing on, you might have miniatures that an overhead camera wouldn't be able to see, so you wouldn't be able to track their positions properly. As a result, if you did want to play a game with the technology, it's likely going to be needed to play on some fairly simplistic terrain, either things that have very minimal amounts of overhanging terrain, or basically a sort of flat terrain map where you have things that represent the different buildings, but don't actually obscure things, which I guess will be one other downside. Apparently the transponder tokens that you put next to units could be used to roughly determine the places under overhanging terrain, but obviously not quite as accurately without tracking for individual miniatures. To test this all out, I was lucky enough to be able to try a very, very early test version of this. The guy who runs the entire thing, called Chris, gave me the opportunity to try basically the pre-alpha version of the thing, which as expected did have a whole load of issues and the user interface wasn't the most intuitive in the world, though to be honest I was kind of impressed as to how much it could do, or at least this system was getting things close enough that you could imagine that they could be fixed with a whole load of bug patches. Basically the demo game that I played looked something not too dissimilar to this. As mentioned before, it was using sort of flattened stylistic terrain. The units move around with those little paper transponder tokens next to them, and then you've got a bunch of objective markers with 1, 2, 3 and 4 for calibration and the models to fight over. It was really quite a small skirmish game as opposed to any sort of big 2,000 point game of 40k. Though to be honest I feel like just trying to get it working for a smaller scale combat patrol sort of game is definitely enough of a challenge to be going on with. In terms of the things that worked well on this demo game, I was able to mount my phone adequately above the battlefield, and the camera display did work pretty well through the in-browser version of the game system that it has going at the moment, and after a couple of teething issues with the transponders, it was basically able to lock them to each individual unit, and then basically recognise my units as we went through the turn sequence, moving, shooting and fighting and things. The idea was that each player would command their turn, go through all the steps, and each time there'd be movement, the machine would take some photos to track where the models were and what could see what and things. One thing I was quite impressed with was resolving the attacks and damage, which was, if anything, faster than rolling out the dice normally. We had 6 different units across a couple of different armies, with Blood Angel, Space Marines versus Orcs, and with the basic combat sequence of that also flowed really quite smoothly. I did try out the computer version versus AI as well, which seemed to make broadly sensible decisions, though to my understanding it was a very, very early version of the program, and maybe using some slightly basic logic as to where to move the units around, with a basic if this then do this kind of system, as opposed to being some sort of really intelligent player behind the scenes. I guess if they were going through a machine learning sort of process, it'd probably need a whole bunch of data before it actually became any good. For issues and downsides that I had with the practice game, measuring ranges had some technical problems. It did feel like it had the miniatures in position, but it seemed to make a few systematic errors with having things out by the same number. Apparently this was a combination of a couple of different issues that have both since been patched. It felt like the system did know the actual position of the models on the board, but just needed some problems ironing out. We didn't use the dice detection thing at all. As mentioned, I suspect that could be a little bit on the clunkier side, but I guess I've yet to see how it might be implemented. And for the game that we played, we went just for the absolute most basic unit interactions, so an absolutely massively long way from an actual proper game of Warhammer 40k, no stratagems or unit abilities or complex missions or things like that, more for the fun of using the technology than trying to do anything serious in game. As mentioned, we also used the flat terrain as well, so more of a battle map as opposed to the actual 3D style battlefield that people play on. The guy who's running it is a gentleman called Chris Foster. He's a PhD data scientist, and interestingly enough, a lot of his prior work experience comes from using data-driven things to counter cheating in tests. He's basically started Wargame Simulator as a bit of a passion project that he hopes might turn into something greater. After playing Warhammer in the 90s and working on this on the background for quite some time, the main primary aim of Wargame Simulator is apparently to try and make gameplay flow a little bit faster and a bit easier, plus all sorts of fun, interesting benefits on the side of trying to make actual physical war games have some of the advantages of things done in cyberspace. The way he's planning to launch the project is a Kickstarter that's just gone live like yesterday, and the idea behind this is to fund the development from an early alpha model to a finished product and try and make something that's either fun or valuable to a bunch of hobbyists out there, people who enjoy their technology. For the Kickstarter, the lowest pledge is $24, and the general aim of this is to help the project get funded and supply server costs, as there's a lot of computing power involved in this. The higher tiers get access to the tools at an earlier stage in development. I believe that the lowest pledge wouldn't actually get access till sometime much later in 2025 with the early access phase that's planned. And then higher tiers get some combinations of physical tokens and objective markers, access to the alpha or beta, and a few other fun design rewards for the highest backers. After the thing goes live, the plan is to continue to fund it via a subscription basis for server costs and everything. He has made quite a lot of tiers for people backing at different levels. Each of them come with a number of months included on the eventual subscription thing, as well as the other benefits. Here's his idea for a timeline for the Kickstarter, aimed at a full launch next year. Apparently the alpha planned to be released in February, the beta in April, then an early access phase in July, and an overall launch in October. My instinct is probably to take timelines like that with a bit of a pinch of salt though where new technology is concerned. I feel like it's kind of hard to be 100% certain of exact timelines when you don't know what sort of developmental issues and challenges you might run into. Then after the thing goes live, apparently the idea is a $4 per month subscription or an $8 one for a few added bonuses on top of that and access to the computer opponents. He really wasn't too keen to do a subscription model, but it seems to be the only way that would really work given server costs and access to AI models, though he wants to try and make a subscription model that's fairer than most, where if you don't use the thing for a month then you're not charged for it, so potentially you could just forget about it and not get charged again if you weren't using it, which is a bit nicer than some of the other companies. They'll just charge you regardless if you forget to cancel. I feel like the idea itself really is quite a fun one, though I feel like at this stage it's going to be kind of niche appeal. I think it's probably going to have interest for people who are interested in technology for its own sake and like the idea of doing cool stuff as opposed to being super appealing for, say, a more mainstream Warhammer audience right now. He absolutely said that I could talk about all the potential criticisms and downsides of this in the video, as I must admit I'm perhaps a little bit apprehensive just due to the scale of the challenges that this thing is trying to overcome. It really does feel like it's breaking new ground and trying to do a bunch of things that people haven't really done in wargaming before. Perhaps the biggest source of apprehension is that it's just trying to do so many things at the same time, all of which need to work for the entire thing to come together. I feel like any one individual bit of it, if it manages to get developed and works well, would be quite an impressive achievement in itself. Say just the model recognition and tracking system. If that could work really seamlessly in game, then I think that would be very impressive. Automatically measuring ranges and line of sight I think would be really quite cool. Never mind all the other really big things that are trying to be done here. Make a computer understand all of Warhammer 40k's rules, and then also have the computer actually be able to use those rules in a semi-convincing way to play against a regular player. It does feel like the sort of thing that might be a lot more commonplace in the future, but trying to break new grounds to this extent all at once is probably going to have a whole bunch of teething problems and take a bit of crazy amount of work and effort to make work well. In particular, I feel like the game Warhammer 40k in itself is going to be a big challenge to this. As someone whose job it is to basically keep up with Games Workshop's news and updates all the time, they really do change a lot and have all sorts of weird quirks and things that just wouldn't be very easy to standardise all that well. Each time there's a new edition, you have to make like 500 plus datasheets work, Never mind if people want to delve into Legends rules or play with other things like Crusade or narrative things, or even make their own datasheets. I feel like it'd basically be a kind of full-time job to keep the system up to date with that, even if using shortcuts like using Battlescribe and new recruit data and exporting their files to be able to use those in list building, which is apparently what the system intends to be able to do. You then have to find ways of quickly executing things like balance updates and each new codex that comes out in turn. I feel like 40k does like its weird mechanics as well. Things like actions, secondaries, stratagems, return to reserve, and sticky objectives, and all the other admin things of Warhammer 40k that maybe aren't too bad to keep track of if you have an army that you know well, and they're generally understood concepts, but trying to make a computer be able to understand them, and also be able to trigger all of those things with a relatively easy user interface, again feels like it could be a pretty massive and kind of never-ending job, particularly when a whole load of your work is knocked flat by a new edition of the game. For the physical applications of cameras and battlefields and things, you would need to have a bit of technology to get things set up, and it wouldn't be all that portable. A couple of telescopic arms and clamps could be enough to set up a camera above a board, but that's another thing to transport around, and it might not work amazingly on every single table that you go on. It feels like the sort of thing that would be easier to do at a home setup or somewhere that's already rigged up for recording, as you sometimes get at Warhammer events and things. You would also need to have an extra smartphone or device to run it on, whether you're using it for the camera or to operate the app. So you might want, say, a computer and a smartphone, or might need a spare smartphone or tablet. Battery life could also be an issue if you've got something that's plugged into a stand overhead, and you might need to feed a wire up there if you are intending to, say, have a 3 or 4 hour game of Warhammer perhaps. Another thing that struck me is that the user interface would have to be really quite slick, as again you're trying to make a computer understand all of the complexity of the mechanics in Warhammer. When I played the test game, there was a fair bit of clicking through of things like the movement phase, then move on to the shooting phase, and going through each unit and allocating their weapons individually. It does mean that you save a whole load of time in terms of the actual dice rolling if you use the auto-resolve type things, but it does take a few bits of other time in other areas. I feel like fine manoeuvres could be maybe a little bit harder to get right, perhaps the technicalities of charging and fighting and piling in and consolidating, though I guess most of that maybe the computer wouldn't necessarily need to have to understand, just which models could attack and then where the models' positions are at the end of the turn. And perhaps fixing any errors or misplay could be a bit more of a technical challenge if you don't know the software too well. I guess you'd have to have the system set up so that a human could override it with any one thing if it's trying to do something that doesn't make sense or can't be done, and being able to correct things that were inputted wrong, such as removing models on the table that should have died or restoring them when you've realised you've made an error or something. You could also make the criticism that quite a lot of this could be done in Tabletop Simulator. If you really want digitised Warhammer 40k, then lots of people already play with that, and it does have a lot of the same advantages. I guess the idea that you're trying to do here, though, is to actually use your physically nicely painted models in-game, but then also double dip on a bunch of the advantages of playing in the digital world as well. Feels like there might be a little bit of overlap of goals there. I guess Tabletop Simulator does have its upsides as well as downsides, such as being able to play with any miniatures that you want and against anyone across the world. Definitely feels like their community could be more of an ally than an opposition, though, potentially. Otherwise, I found the idea of Warhammer versus computer to be an interesting one. I feel like everyone's gone a bit AI crazy over the past couple of years in terms of content and companies snapping it on everything. I must admit, when applied to Warhammer though, I'd be a little bit on the sad side if Warhammer 40k became a little bit too easy to be a solved game, or at least have a computer be able to play the game to beyond human levels. Not sure to be much fun to have some sort of computer assistant and have the game all figured out in some way. I think in reality that would very much be a long way off being an actual problem. There are just a crazy amount of variables in Warhammer, 26 armies to be matched up against 26 others, constant rules changes and lots of different ways that you could play those armies, so it's probably not really an actual serious concern at any time in the near future. Though I feel like it is probably something that's going to happen to most games in general. You'll be able to have a machine play it better than a human at some stage. It's more a matter of when that's the case rather than if. Probably a bit tangential to this entire thing, but I guess it did cross my mind when you're talking about playing Warhammer against a computer. Finally, for the risk and downside of things, I will just bear in mind Kickstarter things in general can be a bit unreliable. By their nature, they're sort of giving investment towards someone to do their best to develop a product, and they don't always work out. I feel like that's probably going to be more risk than normal for novel technology than most other things with solid track records and have already delivered things multiple times over. If you are thinking about supporting something on a Kickstarter like this, always bear in mind there's at least some chance that any given project might fail for a number of different reasons. I'd probably treat this as more speculation and money that you might not necessarily see back if things go south. I say the technological developments are probably the biggest risks here. I'd also be a little bit apprehensive of Games Workshop occasionally pushing back on things that use Warhammer in a big way, even if this is a system that could be used for other games like one-page rules. To my understanding, simply sharing the game rules with files like Battlescribe does wouldn't be an issue, in the same way that the army list builders can get away with it. I feel like they'd just have to be careful treading around other things around their IP though. In any case though, I definitely found the entire thing pretty interesting. It does make me wonder whether or not some sort of digitised wargaming with a mix of physical miniatures on the table and a bunch of computer assisted things could be the future of playing model soldiers at some stage, at least for people most interested in technology and playing games with a different sort of experience. A big thank you to Wargame Simulator for reaching out, sponsoring a video, and showing off their fun system to me of course, and being quite so happy with me talking about a few takes on the pros and cons of it. In any case, I'll leave their Kickstarter link in the video description. Looks like a good few people have already backed this prior to me sharing it. Let me know all your thoughts on them down in the comments below. Would this be the sort of thing that you'd have any interest in or not at all? As always, look forward to hearing your thoughts and opinions. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll be back with some more regularly scheduled 40k content sometime within the next 12 hours or so, and I do tend to post 40k focused videos just about every day. Feel free to check out the links down in the video description. There'll be the Kickstarter page there, and also things like the channel Patreon page, and some discount affiliate links for getting Warhammer a little bit cheaper, all the ways to support the channel if you'd like to. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.